Hey, everybody. Welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Amy. Today, I'm talking to Dan Wuori. He is an early childhood educator and policy consultant that you probably already know from his social media feeds at Dan Wuori, which pair daily lessons in child development with adorable video examples, leading the New York Times to call his Twitter account a font of delight and edification that is educational, but also, simply put, aw. Today, we're going to be talking about Dr. Wuori's new book, The Daycare Myth, What We Get Wrong About Early Care and Education, and What We Should Do About It. Welcome, Dan.
Amy, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here.
This seems like this book builds on what you created with your social media, which is turning these moments that we all share on Instagram and send to each other of adorable babies, say like a toddler throwing an entire bookshelf, one book at a time off the bookshelf, deeply absorbed. And you say like, this is adorable, but there's something else happening here. Did you set out to create this sort of library of early childhood development? What did you think when you started making these videos might be the response?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you that there had been some great master plan. I had been on Twitter and a social media user for many years, but actually for a time was writing primarily about my work in the policy space, and just started running across more and more of these amazing videos. And it struck me, as I began my career as a kindergarten teacher, and when I went to graduate school to begin my journey in early childhood education, what I learned about child development, I had to read in a book. And so it was very detached and theoretical in a lot of ways. And it started to dawn on me that these amazing examples that really illustrate all of the things that I was learning are available and out in the public on social media. And boy, people really started responding as I started sharing and unpacking those videos. And so you're right, though, that a part of it is at this point kind of a broader plan, and it connects to the content of the book as well. In that, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think we frequently look at these things as being adorable, but don't necessarily always pause to look at all of the amazing learning and development that is on display. And so it has been my hope to really illuminate those aspects of those videos. And the book is sort of an effort to bridge what we know about the science of early learning with how that is enacted in public policy, or in this country more often than not enacted in public policy. And so I see it as sort of a 1-2 punch. There's the illustration of just how important these years are, and the book is more of an unpacking of, well, if we know that's the case, then why does this matter, and what do we need to do?
Right, right. If every moment is a teachable moment in a
That's
very
right.
gentle and positive way, every interaction with a toddler is a chance for them to learn. Then there's also a responsibility that comes with that,
That's right.
as you argue, we're sort of skating past. All right, well, let's get to the book. You start in the book with the food pyramid of the early 90s, which I remember well, telling us that oils and fats were bad, don't eat those. Meat was good. Best of all, at the bottom, lots and lots of Frosted Flakes and
No.
and white bread. Make sure you get a lot of that every day. And as you said, it's 30 years later, that is definitely not great advice, but a whole generation of public policy was built around it. And it's taken a long time to sort of unlearn, like, oh, maybe we had this completely upside down. And your book is not about nutrition, but it does use that as a springboard that I think all of us can identify with, like, oh, right, we kind of got that wrong and might have made things worse instead of better. And then you sort of say, what else might be, and then you sort of say, what else might we be getting wrong? And leads us to the thesis of the book.
Absolutely right. In 1992, as you mentioned, the U.S. Department of Agriculture put out, and if your listeners are old enough, I think it was just yesterday, but it was, I guess,
That's right.
30,
It was yesterday.
34
I
years ago,
agree.
or 32 years ago now. It's hard to imagine at this point in time, a modern nutritionist saying, the way to control your weight is really to look at having 8 to 11 servings of pasta a day. It's sort of shocking in hindsight that spawned this entire sort of low fat movement.
Yes.
And there were those Snackwell's cookies that nobody could buy because they were so popular. They were, cookies without any fat, but just loaded with carbohydrates. Now, 30 plus years later, and just how far off base that was. And you're right, the book sort of uses that as a springboard in the opening pages to say, where else might we be getting things sort of boldly and catastrophically wrong. And it makes the case that there's probably lots of places that we're getting things boldly wrong, but certainly chief among them, in my mind, is our policy toward young children and families and toward the professionals who work with them. And that is all based on this sort of fundamental misunderstanding that we have sort of allowed to perpetuate for almost 100 years now, where we think about the early years as being a time where children simply need care. And I want to say clearly, I'm not disparaging the concept of care, because children absolutely need care and need it in abundance. But we've created this artificial divide between care and education, right? That young
Yes.
children need care, and then as they get slightly older, they go to kindergarten, and we hope that they go to kindergarten ready to learn, as though that is where learning begins. And what we know now, with increasing clarity, is that the young children are not only born learning, but that we have a growing evidence base that some important learning actually begins in utero, right? That children start to organize their cognition around the language, or the patterns and the rhythms of their mother's native language, which they begin organizing in utero, and even recognize and display a preference for their mother's native language, even in the hours right after birth. And so that brings us to a really difficult question, right? If we know that young children are learning even before birth, it really changes the scenario here, right? If what we need in the early years is not simply a place for children to be kept safe and warm and well fed while their parents go to work, but instead that this is an opportunity to really optimize their early development, we need to look at our policy very differently, because we have almost a century long history at this point, at least at the federal level, of sort of ostensibly investing in young children in ways that are really actually investments in their parents' workforce participation, right?
Right.
The first child care investment that the federal government made was in the early 1930s as part of the New Deal, when President Roosevelt was helping to bring the country out of the Great Depression. The way they did that, in large part, was through the creation of these public works projects that offered lots of new employment opportunities for adults, and so in order for them to take those opportunities, they needed a place for their children. And so we have a sort of 100 years of uh, sort of investing in childcare, but in ways that actually don't have a whole lot to do with the young children, and a lot more to do with adults.
Let's talk about the daycare myth itself, the sort of
Yeah.
provocative title, and you unpack it in the book that daycare, I'm going to quote you here. You say, daycare in reality simply doesn't exist. I don't mean it's in short supply and difficult to access. I mean it literally, as in it isn't a thing. Explain that for everybody.
It isn't a thing, and I think I've shared a little bit of sort of that thinking here already, but I think we have conceptualized, to be clear, obviously there are businesses all over the country that bill themselves as such. Parents are paying thousands of dollars a month out of pocket to these businesses. What I'm talking about there is really sort of our conceptualization of daycare as just this sort of safe, warm place where children are kept while their parents are able to go and participate in the workforce, and that we have thought of a daycare or childcare as being really sort of in its own little bubble, separate and
Right.
distinct from education. And what we know, in fact, is that it's all early childhood education. As you said in the opening, every environment for young children is a learning environment. Really, the question is, how good a learning environment is it?
And it's this idea you quote an early childhood professional in the book who says, I don't care for days, I care for children. Just this idea of calling it daycare underlines that it's sort of conceptualized as a service for the parents, not a service for the children. And that
Well, and
leads to
that's
cut to falling short on providing what the children need?
it can certainly. I mean, and I want to be clear that I don't think that this is a misconception that is widely held within the field.
Right, 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 right.
But among the public and in particular among policymakers, we see over and over examples of efforts, for example, to further deregulate childcare. Right, policymakers who say, "Oh, well, childcare is facing a real financial challenge. What if we were to loosen the ratios and we were to allow more children per teacher?" Um, and we know developmentally that that is really misguided. I know so many of your audience members, myself included, are parents, and so think for a minute of just how overwhelming it is to take care of a single newborn,
Right.
and then imagine yourself being the mother or father of quadruplets, right? And trying to take care of four newborns at once. And the truth is that four newborns at once is sort of the gold standard in our childcare system at this point. I mean, those are the ratios that get you nationally accredited, a ratio of 4 to 1. And so the idea that we will dramatically improve childcare by allowing even more, infants, for example, to an individual professional is misguided and something that ultimately we're going to end up paying the cost for in very significant ways for decades to come.
I'm talking to Dr. Dan Wuori. His new book is The Daycare Myth, and we'll be right back. Dan, I wanted to be sure to underline something you said, which this book is very much not about the early childhood workforce needing to work harder. They already work very hard for very poor compensation. I'm going to quote something from the book: 59 cents less per hour than dog walkers, according to recent data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So you are very much arguing in this book that early childcare professionals deserve more support and pay, not less.
Absolutely the case. And in fact, I'm arguing in the book that not only are we wise to get away from some of the terminology around daycare and childcare and replace it with what it actually is, but that we also need to update our terminology and our thinking around this workforce. These are not daycare workers, right? These are
Mhm.
not childcare providers. These are teachers. And I think, one of the most important messages, maybe for your audience and for moms in particular, is that as you are looking at an early childhood education program, you are not selecting a babysitter, right? You are literally selecting the adults who will co-construct your child's brain. And that's a very different way of looking at the situation. And so, far from being a criticism of the early childhood workforce, I like to think of the book as really championing their case that we need to look at them and their work very differently, and we need to get to a place where we are compensating them as the professionals that they are.
As the completely right, they're commensurate with the important work that they're doing. They're creating the brains of the next generation of people. It's kind of an
Absolutely.
important job. Let's talk about the three simple truths of early development that you talk about in the book, because these seem very, once you understand them, pretty evident, and then we can apply them to what needs to change in early childhood care. So, talk us through the three simple truths of early
Sure.
development.
So the three simple truths are sort of my effort to encapsulate some of the important lessons that we know from the science of early development. I've already talked about one of them, which is that learning begins in utero and never stops. Right, and so this idea that we want to get children ready to learn is sort
Right.
of a silly one.
Okay.
Ultimately, children are already coming into the world learning. There's nothing to get them ready for. The second there is that the realization that the period from prenatal to three is the single most consequential window in all of human development. It's during this time that the fundamental architecture of the brain is wired in ways that hopefully will help to support our long-term success both in school and life. But the third of those truths is that we know that optimal development really hinges on stable, nurturing relationships with highly engaged adults. And so that's where I think parents have to give a lot of really careful thought. as they're bringing a newborn into the world. Those relationships need to happen. Now,
Right.
do they need to happen exclusively at home? Not necessarily. But it makes the choice of an early childhood setting for your child terrifically important. And so, one way or another, we need to be looking as parents and making sure that our children are in the company all day long of highly engaged adults who are going to be really attentive to their developmental needs.
You have a recent video on your social media that was a 3-year-old boy coming out of his first day of preschool and telling his mother, "I didn't learn anything, anything." And then she said, "Did you have fun?" And he said, "Yes." And you, well, tell everyone what you explained in the caption for that video.
Yeah, what I used that video for you, and just as obviously very happy little guy coming out
Right.
of his very first day of preschool. They didn't teach me anything, but I also, there wasn't enough time to talk about possums. Was sort of
Right.
his
Right. I have
quote.
2
And
problems.
and as a teacher, I use that as an illustration that that's actually a wonderful endorsement of that preschool classroom. That in fact, if you go into a classroom a first day with 3-year-olds, as was the case in this video, and what you see is an adult standing in front of a classroom speaking to the group lecture style, or if what you find is children sitting at tables or desks doing exactly the same thing at the same time, that actually maybe that's a program to avoid, right?
Mm,
That what we know is that young children learn through play, they learn through discovery, through trial and error, and in a way that is very similar to the scientific method. Um, and that the very best early childhood teachers are sort of, we say they're sort of like guides on the side, right? Instead of being up at the front of the classroom. Now, to maybe the untrained eye, that can look very messy when you go into a classroom and you see children all playing independently and the teacher circulating and working with a couple of kids or one child at a time. Um, but that's exactly what young children need and how they thrive. And it's important not to mistake those for not being very rich learning
mm.
environments, right? That those teachers have to be terrifically planful and observant and really ready to step in and guide and extend and question all throughout the day. I use that video basically as an example to say, don't mistake stereotypical thinking about what a teacher looks like for older children as being what preschoolers need most to thrive.
So one of the things that change would require is changing, the curriculum for early childhood. I don't even know if there is a curriculum right now. I imagine that pre-K, universal pre-K, there's a sort of standard thing teachers are supposed to do. Is there right now a standard curriculum for daycares and childcare?
There are evidence-based preschool curriculum models that are used pretty widely. There's not a sort of a national a curriculum, but the best of them really support teachers in what I've just described, right?
Mm.
That it's following young children's interests and observing and extending the learning that they are displaying, rather than what we're not looking for when I think frequently when we think of a curriculum, quote unquote, we're thinking of textbooks and teacher manuals and scripts and all of those things. And that's certainly not what we're looking for in early childhood.
It's more thinking about another video that you posted recently. It was a toddler, I think she was about 13 months old, and she was just walking down a path and stopping and saying, "What's this? What's this?" And the grown up with her is like, "That's a stream. What's this? That's more stream." And
That's
then
still more
right, right.
stream. I love
And
that.
every 3 seconds she was saying, "What's this? What's this?" And you made the point that that's a rich learning environment for that child. It's child led, and she's going to ask it 100 times, and you answer it 100 times, and try to stay engaged. And that's a terrific day for that little kid.
It can be a little overwhelming for parents for sure
Right.
when you get to that what is this a stage, or why as the question to everything. But it's important to recognize. I think even in that post I shared a couple of weeks ago, my family and I made our first ever trip to the Grand Canyon. And I'll confess to you, Amy, I was not into this plan. It was
Uh-huh.
we were driving my oldest across country for graduate school. This was way out of the way on our travel itinerary, and took us hours off track. And I kind of thought, I've seen the Grand Canyon, right? I've seen it in movies and
I get
pictures,
it.
and
Yeah.
like I get it. I don't need to do. And I mean, I can't begin to describe though the absolute wonderment that I experienced being there near sunrise and just seeing something that took my breath away. As adults, we very rarely have those kinds of experiences, right? We've kind of
Yeah.
been there and done that. But if you think about the world, particularly for a new toddler, babies begin so dependent, so much so that they, early on, as their neck muscles aren't well developed, their eyesight is poor, they lack even the ability to kind of direct their line of vision. Um, and so to get to a year of age, to the place where you're taking your first steps and able to explore the world in a new way, young children experience that sort of wonderment. You use that example of the little girl walking down the nature path with her parents, but a stream was something completely new. A pine cone was something completely new.
Yeah.
And so it really is an amazing time, and it's I think helpful for parents to sort of frame their thinking about just how special these years are. It's exciting as an adult actually to get to view the world kind of with new eyes again.
I'm talking to Dr. Dan Wuori, author of the new book, The Daycare Myth, and we'll be right back. Dan, changing all of this, I'm sure the naysayers would say, well, we don't have the money to do this. But you argue in the book, we're already paying the cost for this in the dumbest possible ways. So tell us how we're paying for this now by not doing it.
I mean, it's very much. I make the case in the book. We are paying for young children and their needs very much in the same style as like a payday loan, right? The loan companies that you see in a strip mall
Mm-hmm.
next to the grocery store, that they'll lend you $100 for 2 weeks, but you got to pay $250 back. We are meeting the needs of our young children and families at the highest possible long-term cost, not only to children, but to all of us as taxpayers. And so the book is sort of makes the case in a couple of different ways here. First, we know to talk about the sort of the long-term case, or the longitudinal case here. We know from decades of research that high-quality early childhood investments pay huge dividends to society. 13.1% annual return is what James Heckman, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, formerly of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, has estimated here. That outpaces, by the way, the Standard and Poor's 500's annual returns for the 5, 10, 20, and 30-year
Wow.
periods, most recently. And the reason for that is that we know that these programs help in K-12 education, for example, to mitigate the need for remediation and for retention in grade level and for special education placements. And we know that later on in life, that children who have had these high quality experiences are less dependent on social services, for example. They have better health outcomes, which is, I think, sort of a cutting edge part of the research here. But we know that our early childhood experiences have profound long term impacts on the human body. And so, that we could be saving in social services and healthcare and education costs and interactions with the criminal justice system.
Mm.
We've got this amazing array of economic data that suggests that we have the potential actually to shrink the obligation to taxpayers, to shrink ultimately the size of government, not through draconian cuts to services that families are relying on, but by simply being proactive. And the whole uh, uh, saying about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We're paying for pounds and pounds of cure at this point. as a result of our failure to get things right in the first place. And so we know that longitudinally, but we also know that in real time. I think it's important to say to policymakers, because it's hard. I work extensively with governors, with state lawmakers around the country, and I know that they're always in the position of having to sort of think through, we've got to have a budget this year, right? And we got these problems right in the here and now. And so sometimes it's difficult to think in terms of, well, if we make this investment now, think of how different things will be 30 years from now. But we also have great evidence to suggest that we are paying loads and loads in real time. My colleagues at a group called Ready Nation, which is an organization of business executives who are interested in this topic, did a fascinating study about a year and a half ago where they looked at the real-time economic drain on the country that results from lack of high quality programs for infants and toddlers alone. So not early care and education writ large for all children, but just for young children. And the price tag that they tag that at is $122 billion, billion with a B. And that's a loss to the economy and to families last year, this year, and the price that we're going to be paying next year if we don't work on investing more proactively in children and families.
So, if for a parent listening to this episode, we always want to make sure we give people sort of actionable takeaways. So, I wanted to talk about actionable takeaway to sort of change the conversation around this. What can each listener do about that? And then also, if a listener is pregnant or has a small child and is considering a early child care environment for her child or his child, what would you suggest are sort of the things that you should be looking for?
Well, maybe I'll start by I'll take the second question
Okay.
first. So, if you are looking for an early childhood environment for your child, one of the things that I recommend in the book, really, maybe two things prominently that I would point to. One is go and visit. And when I say go and visit, because I think everybody ultimately does sort of go and visit before they select a program, but I mean really visit. I don't mean take a 30-minute or 30-second sort of stroll
Mhm.
down the hallway and peek in the windows. Ask for some time in those classrooms and spend 30 minutes and observe and see what this classroom that you might be enrolling your child in really looks like during the day. And in particular, what I would advise that you be looking for, kind of back to those three simple truths of early development, is the interaction quality, right? Go in there and watch the adults. I think frequently there is a temptation to be taken by what might be a really beautiful setting, right? It's a
Mhm.
lovely building and all the a beautiful playground and all the materials look so fresh and clean, and all of those are important things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, not all that important, right? The beauty of the classroom setting is by far secondary to what happens in it. And so watch the adults. If what you see in that classroom is two adults who are standing off in a corner talking to one another, then you're in the wrong place, right? What you're hoping to see is, particularly for infants and toddlers, we're looking for adults that are down at eye level on the floor, interacting, mirroring the language of the children, extending those conversations, asking questions, playing alongside, and extending their play. And so, one of the lessons to parents in the book is, given the choice between a pretty building and highly engaged adults, go with the adults
Mhm.
every single time, right? A couple of other things that maybe you could be looking for. We talked about ratios earlier. I think really digging in on this question of how many kids are in the classroom and what are the ratios of teachers to children. The lower that ratio, the more you know that there will be individualized attention for your child that will help to optimize their development. Another thing that I think is always worth parents exploring and questioning as part of that selection process, and this may sound like a simple question. Do the teachers have paid sick leave? Is an interesting question to me. You may be surprised to find in many cases that the answer is no. And so, that when you find that you are in a situation where a teacher is having to choose between coming to work sick, or foregoing her family's income, um, that's not a good
Mm,
situation, right? You don't want your child in a setting where a teacher has to come to work with a fever, for example, or potentially contagious, just to earn an income, for the day. So, I think those are very important. And then you may also ask, even though, I think some of what I'm talking about here, um, may get at this point, ask about the quality. Many states have quality rating systems, and so ask if the center has been rated, and if so, investigate a little bit about the quality rating system and
mm,
but what I mean. It's almost like the grades that are put on restaurants, right? You don't want to send your child to a center that has a D on the window. The other thing certainly to look for is something like national accreditation. There are governing bodies for both center-based programs and family programs that have accreditations that go well above and beyond what states require in basic licensing. And when you find a program that is nationally accredited, it's a good indicator that they're working to go above and beyond. The last thing that I would suggest that parents maybe really explore, and I think this is a really important question that might be your own way of measuring quality. Find out how long that teacher has been there,
mm.
or how long teachers in general have been at the center. We know at this point, you mentioned earlier that we're in this workforce crisis where many teachers in the early childhood field are being paid at or near their state's minimum wage. It results in estimates of up to a 40% attrition rate out of those classrooms every single year. And so when you discover that a teacher has only been there for 6 weeks or 2 months, it's probably not a great surprise in a lot of cases. But boy, when you find out that a teacher has been there for 5 years, boy, that's a big green light for you to know, because typically that then is a program that values its teachers, that it's a good work environment and a place where teachers are happy, and you certainly want happy teachers.
For sure. And then what about, is it elected officials? Who should we be contacting, and what would we highlight when we do?
Yeah, so the book is really written, as you know from looking at it, for three different audiences, right? For parents, for policymakers, and for early childhood professionals, and that's a pretty broad swath in a lot of ways. We tried to square that up. At the end of each chapter is a section that we call I call the bipartisan blueprint for change, and it is sort of a chapter summary that speaks directly to each of those individual audiences. So, here in chapter one, what are the big takeaways for you if you're a policymaker, or what if you're a parent? I think a lot of this book is ultimately for policymakers, in the sense that they're the ones who really have the greatest potential in the short term to address many of these challenges. We want parents to be aware of these challenges as well, because their voices are critically important to policymakers, and helping to influence that decision making. But the book actually lays out a whole collection of sort of proactive ideas that policymakers can undertake, from things as simple as sort of going back into statute and redefining some of the terminology, like we talked about earlier, sort of removing that daycare language and really calling this what it is, which is early childhood education, referring to teachers as teachers, but then also gets later in the book into a whole collection of um, areas where, frankly, state and federal policy, generally with all the right intentions, may actually be serving to undermine the stability of our early childhood systems. And so I think policymakers will find lots of actionable advice in the book.
I loved this book. Dr. Worry's new book is called The Daycare Myth: What We Get Wrong About Early Care and Education and What We Should Do About It. I will put the link to the book in the show notes, and to Dr. Worry's social media feeds too, because you won't want to miss them. Dr. Wuori, anywhere else that our listeners might find you right now or be looking for next?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, I'm posting to multiple social media platforms daily. You can find information on all of that at my website, which is just my name, Dan Wuori, WUORI.com. And it also includes a list of upcoming speaking dates. I'll be doing some dates here over the next couple of months across the United States, and then excited to share, Amy, that I'll be uh, speaking pretty extensively early next year in Ireland and the UK, and so
Wow.
taking the message all across the world as best I can.
Thank you for everything you do, Dan. It was so nice to talk to you today.
Great to talk to you, and thank you for having me.